Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever and wherever you are listening. This is an episode of the Two Lost Souls podcast, all about the Uberization of therapy and burnout. As usual, I am joined in the therapy room today by the sensational Michelle Sudbury. How are you doing, Michelle?
Hello, Ravi. I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I've recently completed a 365-day streak of Duolingo.
What language are you doing?
I've been learning Swedish, so jag kan prata lite svenska just nu, men
Wow.
jag kan bara förstå pyttelite.
And that
Yeah.
means...
So I said I can speak a little Swedish now, but I can only understand very little.
Oh my goodness.
But yeah,
That was beautiful. Well done, Ravi. I love
thank you
that.
very much. I mean, would you have known if it wasn't though?
No, absolutely not. Although I have watched the bridge,
Okay,
and you'd
right.
have thought I'd have picked up some bits from there, you know, but I didn't. No, it sounded great to me.
Thank you very much.
To my ignorant ears, I thought it was amazing. Well done.
How have you been?
I'm utterly devastated today because I was on for a 100-day Peloton streak, Ravi.
Yeah.
And I had to travel back from Wales yesterday and woke up this morning to realise that I'd forgotten to do any activity.
This is the one thing. So listeners may not know this. Both Shell and I do own Peloton bikes.
We do.
I've actually unsubscribed. I've not used mine in months because I think it's going to be mainly a winter thing for me. The problem with Peloton that you don't get with Duolingo is that if you miss a day of Duolingo, you can use your gems or whatever to refill your streak as if you didn't miss it. With Peloton, you don't get that whatsoever, and it is gutting.
Ravi, honestly, I was on the 100-day challenge. I started it on the 1st of June. The 1st of June. I've been doing it that long, and I've got, 20 odd days to go.
Right, got you.
And I've lost it.
It's awful.
So,
I'm so sorry.
Well,
it's to be honest,
hideous.
100 rides on the Peloton probably is as painful as a bereavement, I think, actually, just physically.
Now, I've got to completely fess up as well now. That they're not all actual rides.
Oh, of course not, because you're exactly like me in the fact that you probably get to 11 o'clock at night, realised you haven't done anything, and do a quick 5-minute mindfulness yoga.
Oh my goodness. Me and Dennis doing a little meditation. Yes. Yeah, that's what I'll do, Ravi. So most of them are rides. I'm very proud because most of them are rides. But there are...
Do you want to know the ultimate hack, though?
Is there a hack? Can I get my streak back?
Well, you can't get it back, I'm afraid. But next time, you can just log a walk.
Yeah, I did that in Wales. So this is what makes it even worse. On the Saturday, we went for a lovely long coastal walk where I sweated a lot because it was incredibly hot. Logged that, got my 10,000 steps, all beautiful. Logged that as a Peloton walk. Yesterday, sat on my bum, did nothing until the evening, and then drove for 5 hours and then went straight to bed without doing anything.
Bigger hack, could you not have logged that as a cycle ride, like an outdoor cycle ride?
Yeah, I think that might have flagged as being slightly dodgy because I never go that far. I mean, I'm a low impact 30-minute kind of girl. But yeah, no, it's in the grand scheme of things, it's not really a biggie. I am devoed.
It's awful as someone who's been in a very similar position, it's absolutely gutting.
But I have got a 54-week streak, so
yeah,
I'm going to get that to 100, and that will be...
Let's be honest, Shell, the weekly streak is what we all fall back on when there's nothing left to gain from the daily streak because we've lost it.
Feels very hollow.
It's the consolation prize.
It's not the same. I'm looking at my calendar now, Ravi. I can see it in front of me. It's really, really sad. But hey, the world keeps turning.
The world keeps turning.
My Peloton wheel didn't, but the world did.
Well, I was about to say pedals keep turning, and hey, you can always start again.
Yeah, and if Peloton are listening and quite like us advertising them,
well, yeah, and not to shame them or anything into it, but we did email you at some point, Peloton.
We did.
You didn't respond.
No.
So and we both, until I unsubscribed, we were both using your product daily,
and I'm active. So, I'm an active Peloton user.
And I will be acknowledged. If you sponsor us, I will come back. This is my promise to you. So, hey, Peloton, if you'd like to advertise, hello@twolostsouls.co.uk. And while you're at it, make some kind of feature where you can win your streak back. How's that?
Yes, please. Yes, please. I would do 4 rides today if I could get my streak back.
Yeah.
If there was some way of paying some penance and, undoing that sin, I would do it. Yeah. But hey, yeah.
Well, that's our come and get me plea for this episode. Done. We have the pleasure of being joined in the therapy room today by Dr. Elizabeth Cotton. Elizabeth is the Associate Professor of Responsible Business at the University of Leicester and the founder of Surviving Work, which carries out socially engaged research about mental health and its relationship to work. She's the trustee of the British Sociological Association and the chair of the editorial board for Work, Employment and Society, a BSA journal looking at the sociology of work. She's worked extensively with health teams and trade unions, including as head of education for the Miners International IndustriALL. She has worked as a psychotherapist in the NHS and reports to also having had lots of therapy as well. And Elizabeth runs the Digital Therapy Project, a group of UK and US researchers and practitioners interested in understanding future therapies from both sides of the therapeutic relationship. Elizabeth's upcoming book, UberTherapy, The New Business of Mental Health, has been published by Bristol University Press in October 2025. Elizabeth, welcome to you. How are you, first of all?
Oh, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. See, academics don't get out much, and we expect about 7 people, including your mum, to read your stuff. So, absolutely delighted to be here.
I'm glad this is an exciting little outing. And I suppose to start with, before we kind of focus on the landscape of therapy as we see it today and as we may see it in the future, can we just talk through why the therapeutic working landscape became such a focus for you and why your passions lie in examining what's going on in this environment and beginning to develop it more in the interests of people using it and working in it?
It's a long story. I'm quite old and have lots of experience of very sort of traumatic and awful experiences of work. So like a lot of trades unionists, I had a really weird job in my 20s and 30s of head of education for the Miners International. So I used to be, education is code for organising. So I used to work with unions all over the world, trying to organise responses to it. And I got very good at it. And like a lot of activists, a lot of political activists, I was quite ideologically led. And I became over time so exhausted and so torn between, what I believed and lots of betrayals and disappointments, as politics is a very rough game. And you're also working so hard on something that you believe in. I had complete burnout. And so a lot of trade unionists go into therapy because, of course, a big part of your work is pastoral. You're really looking after people who are totally destroyed and traumatized through work. No one ever comes to a trades union and says, everything's going great, thanks very much. They always come with a really complex, compounded problem that you probably can't solve. So, and also trade unions often, not always, but often are really bad at talking about feelings. And, also that we often go into action very quickly and we try and solve problems too much. And therapy, of course, is the antithesis to that, where understanding is the name of the game. Like a lot of people who go into training, I came back to the UK and I started training at the Tavistock, which in my sort of naive snobbery, I thought, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to go to the best place in the world. But actually, it is a bit of a nunnery, and it had all these kind of anomalies of the nunnery where no one talked about sex, but also no one talked about money as well. So, I'd earned quite a lot of money as a trades unionist, but I'm used to talking about money and I'm used to talking about hours of work. And I just didn't understand the game. I couldn't understand how I was going to be literally doing this for years, and there was no kind of fast track, and there was no kind of, there was always when you're ready, and it's a bit of a zigzag kind of way to become a professional with no hope of earning a sustainable living. And then in 2012, as I was training as a psychotherapist, I was also working as an academic, which shares a lot of characteristics with the therapy world in terms of the Uberization that's taken place. And I was put in a redundancy pool for the first time in my life in 2011. It was all striking over the pensions, and I worked in a business school. And I realised I totally collapsed inside because I was such an aggressive trades unionist, representing other people and protecting other people. And then when it came to me facing redundancy, I completely collapsed, and I realised I just didn't have any sense of how I was going to survive it. So I started surviving work. I started writing about it, started blogging, and I started doing sort of like workshops. They were very provocatively called, "Do you have to marry a rich man to be a therapist?" in the UK. And I did some weird ones with like Claire Girarda and some of the great and the good. I've always been a good organizer, so I can convince somebody to come and for free sit with me and talk to other people about ideas. So I started doing that, and I did that for years and years. And then it sort of turned into my academic work, really, around researching the therapy sector, just from an industrial relations perspective and from a sociological perspective. Because I think one of one of the strengths and the weaknesses of the therapy profession is that we really go for the details, and we go in deep and into complexity and into each other, and we reflect and self-reflect and reflect in our groups. There's actually a whole world out there, particularly the business model, and in our case in the UK, the policy model and austerity and the attack on welfare and this collusion between welfare and work and healthcare services. So these big macro things are sort of not on the radar. And I, believe passionately the more informed and conscious we are of the systems within which we work as therapists, the more likely we are to be able to navigate it. And I should say the thing that's really good about coming from a trades union background is that I'm really mindful that a lot of the therapy debates about good therapy or bad therapy and about IAPT and about systems really, whether it's conscious or not, so we can debate that as therapists, does a lot of shaming and blaming of individual therapists. And there's an extraordinary hierarchy at what I call in my book a labour aristocracy. I call it in Versailles, that sometimes the therapy world can feel like a 17th century French court. And all of those old inequalities of class, money, how much training you can afford, how much supervision you can, all of that is built in. So the inequalities within the sector are really hard, and they're really hard to acknowledge and talk about. It's easier to say there are bad therapy is the result of bad therapists and leave it at that. So there's a whole kind of systemic debate, which is really hard, that really needs to happen. But I believe really deeply, the more we understand it, the more we can see that landscape, the higher our chance of navigating it is as a sector rather than as just individuals.
There's a strange element of meta-ness to this, I guess, in terms of when we are sitting in the room with a client, we are often the people in the helicopter above the forest guiding them through what they may be seeing in the forest around them. And I get the sense that this is the outer layer of that, right? In terms of the aim here to be educating us therapists on actually what's happening in the forest around us right now when we're so busy staring at the bark of the tree that's immediately right in front of us, because that has to be our immediate priority, or it's made to be. How did we get to this point? I think particularly in the UK, there's a prevailing thought that we are immune to many of the corporate influences that may malign therapeutic models in the rest of the world. Think America, for example, but we've all heard that phrase of America coughs and the rest of the world catches the cold. I'm wondering how we in this country have begun down this path.
Well, it's partly about the rise of neoliberalism. So I'm not saying this as a radical kind of departure. I think we can use the word neoliberalism without saying anything about our personal politics. The business model, particularly in health, is driven by an American model. So it's a neoliberal model of fundamentally undermining public service, replacing it with private medical insurance, replacing it with business to consumer, business to business models of care. And also we've seen the emergence of large digital health companies, again, very much from the States, driven by that agenda, which really by stealth and quite quietly, until quite recently, until the last sort of 3 years, have been snaffling up contracts which made them no money with the NHS, partly to capture data. Medical data is worth a lot of money under platform capitalism, but also to sort of suck up the big contracts. So the other thing that happens under neoliberalism is that size matters. So the size of the economic actor, the size of the business really matters. So large-scale multinational companies, they do happen to come from the States, but that could be different at a different point in our future. But it's about having large-scale contractors snaffle up large-scale contracts with the NHS, because the NHS is sort of the cash cow. But it isn't just about cash, it's also about being the data cow, which for setting up digital systems, large language models, AI technologies, it requires all that data. So at least 10 years, if not 15 years ago, we started to see online support. We started to see the emergence of digital companies taking, for example, IAPT services, providing those. And those companies have now morphed into the next generation of AI therapy companies. So it's been a corporate strategy for a very long time. And these are big companies. They often did it by stealth. There's much more awareness now of the nature of that business. But at the time, we didn't see it coming, and you were considered conspiratorial to mention that these are very particular types of companies. And one of their characteristics is it's not about therapy anymore. It's about data. So these are digital companies. Sometimes they call themselves digital health companies, and they may have expertise in health, but they're definitely not digital therapy companies. So the business model was less interested in what happened as a result of the therapeutic relationship, for example. They're not interested in that particularly. They're interested in using recordings of therapeutic sessions over a 10-year period to develop AI tools and measurements, for example. In the UK context, there was also this winding down, what I call Uberization, but others can call the industrialization of care in this country. I'm going to mention some books as I go through, because as an academic, I believe that reading books is very helpful. But one of the key writers is our friend Rosie Risk, who, of course, worked in IAPT services, has written extensively from the inside about this industrialization process. And she co-edited a fantastic book in 2018 called The Industrialization of Care, which you should read. If you work in IAPT, you've got to know your own history. And it was about this commodification, standardization of therapy in NHS, in IAPT. And you remember that IAPT's birth was as a financial model. It was presented as the solution to a political problem, which is demand is higher than supply, waiting lists are too long, let's find a model that gets people back into work. And so the argument for IAPT right from its beginning was its financial logic, not its clinical logic. That isn't how it was sold. It was sold as a really beautiful dream about access, and it is a beautiful dream, and it happened in some places for a long time. But actually, the programme was supported politically because it offered people becoming economically active again, and it was a cheap model. Why? Because it was short term. It wasn't this short term until a decade later, but in its original inception, it brought in a model of cognitive behavioural therapy, and over time that diversity has gone away. So you have now a very standardised model. And I would argue, without sounding completely paranoid, that the next stage of that Uberization, we've had industrialization, is now automation and digitalization. So the good thing about standardized, scripted CBT, a very limited model of CBT, I'm not against CBT at all. Don't have any axe to grind about it. I think if you have an experienced, compassionate practitioner in a room with another person, great things can happen. And actually to the client, often it doesn't matter what modality you're using, you know, the relationship can override all of those things, is maybe more significant. But actually a heavily standardized and scripted non-clinical model, because a lot of the interventions in the NHS are not clinical by nature. There's a skip and a hop to automation. So it allows much higher levels of automation and the introduction, as we see now, text-based support services and AI technologies. I think it's a surprise to every single person that I know that works in this area, even the American. I work with SciAN, the Psychotherapy Action Network in the States, that was famously sued by Talkspace in 2018 for $40 million for saying, is this therapy? And Data and Society, which is one of the sort of new generation American research institutes about AI. Olivia Garofalo wrote the most amazing report end of last year, I think, or beginning of this year, called Doing the Work, which was about platform therapists. So, but even us, we talk about this stuff all the time. Even we had a meeting today and we were like, God, I just didn't see this bit coming. I didn't see the emergence of AI chatbots as therapy, or ChatGPT being used as therapy openly. Who saw that coming? I didn't even see it 6 months ago, you know. So I think that's the other thing to say. In my book, I talk about it as a fairground, a theme park called Angerland. It's really disorienting how fast this is happening and how meta it feels. If you ask somebody 2 years ago, would you go on to ChatGPT to find a therapeutic solution? People wouldn't know what you were talking about. Now, people are trying it every day.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly things have spiraled from a particular point of view. To coin a CBT term, there's an astonishing amount of cognitive dissonance, right? With Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, saying, don't use ChatGPT as your therapist, but then programming a new version of ChatGPT which delivers you less reassurance. And as our listeners will know, in the therapy world, we're kind of all about being in the business of not giving reassurance. So Sam Altman's response to telling people to not use ChatGPT as a therapist is to make it sound more like a therapist, interestingly. From the perspective of trainees listening, you said a sentence there of a lot of interventions are not clinical in nature within talking therapies. They may be listening and going, hang on a second, we do clinical work.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
This is not to demean how hard and how conscientious, ethical and thoughtful people working in IAPT, particularly PWPs, are. So in the research that I've done over these very many years, I've done lots of sort of big surveys of therapists, including IAPT workers. And I always have a disproportionately high number of PWPs, because PWPs, this doesn't matter which sector you're in. If you're low on the food chain, you're less likely to say what you think, because there's less in it for you and there's more risks. So getting PWPs to talk about their experience is really hard. So it took, a good 15 years of being surviving work and being a trusted space in order to get people to engage. So my surveys always have an unusually high number of PWPs. And they're always the best quotes, and they're always the most politicized and the most thoughtful. Okay, so I believe that wherever you are in the food chain, if you're lower down, you're probably going to speak the truth more clearly, and you'll probably have a much more granular perspective and probably a more informed perspective, because this cognitive dissonance is a real problem. Lots of people express an opinion about a service that they don't understand. So I'm not wishing to say what you're doing isn't real therapy. And I think those real therapy debates within therapy can very quickly become toxic, and I don't engage with them because it just feeds into that blaming and shaming of the individual. But there are two things that really shifted industrially when IAPT came in. One is assessment, so the initial triage and how that changed. Because in the olden days, if you were in the NHS, it was the most experienced clinician on site who did an initial assessment. It was an hour and a half, and it was life-changing at its best. And it was a key part of the therapy. And it was not about getting people off the waiting lists as fast as possible. It was about really understanding what that person may benefit from. There's always been underfunding. So the whole thing of signposting into appropriate services has always been a bit euphemistic in the NHS, because you have to balance getting somebody treatment, as soon as you can as well. But the way that the initial contact and the assessment was done changed dramatically. So we now have a situation where PWPs will do assessments, often 20 minutes on the phone, and that call centre model. That is not a criticism of the PWPs. You have had for many years highly overqualified, experienced people working at all levels within IAPT. I always make the assumption that people are always overqualified for the jobs that they're doing in the therapy world, not underqualified. So it's not a criticism that way. But if you're looking at the function of that initial contact, it's to get people off waiting lists, and it is often in the performance data that gets monitored very closely in services. It's about evidencing treatment within a certain time frame. So the introduction of targets and performance data and performance measurements, that led to this system of a real game being played. Again, I'm not saying that everybody is gaming, but it's inherent in the way that the system is managed, that performance data matters in a way that it doesn't actually matter. So that's one thing, is in the initial contact and the assessment. And that isn't always, and often isn't, carried out by a highly experienced clinician. So there's that. The second thing that really shifted was around supervision and the role of that and the importance of that and the quality of that. So over time, again, because of this big sort of industrialization and this big drive towards performance indicators and the evidence base to feed the system and feed the support for the service, you ended up with supervision becoming non-clinical by nature. So you'd have increasingly managers carrying out supervision, people who are not necessarily clinically trained, certainly not in psychotherapeutic traditions. In the olden days, again, your supervision group was a place of absolute safety, and you could talk about your mistakes, and no one ever said, what did you achieve? And no one asked you about your targets and how much people recovered. It was a genuine supportive space where practitioners could reflect on their practice. Over time, that's often been bred out. And in many cases, of course, particularly with private providers to NHS services, that supervision simply doesn't exist. And then if you're a low paid worker, there is a dilemma about whether you pay privately for your supervision and about long-term sustainability of practice. So I'd say those two changes in the way that performance was managed and the jobs of work that existed within IAPT, I think culturally and clinically made a massive change.
You mentioned also earlier that this transition was happening quietly to start with, and you mentioned the word stealth earlier on. Yeah. Yet it seems like it's become more brazen over the past 3 or so years. Why?
Because the business model is shifting now, it's going up a gear. And now's the time to reclaim the money. In the book, I call it silver linings. So it is about to be digitalized and automated in a way that we haven't seen yet. In the day-to-day, it hasn't happened yet, but all of the ducks have been lined up for that. And also you've seen the business model, which includes text-based support as part of the therapeutic package. So a lot of the big platforms will offer that. So we're in a different market now, and we're in a different business model, which is about these large scale companies now wanting to resell products, particularly AI products that were developed on the basis of the data that they captured when they were providing cheap contracts to the NHS. And now we're into the digital age. It's also about the shift in the business model for platforms and for digital companies. So again, there's, in Uber, there's the whole issue around dynamic pricing, there's subscription-based services, there's private medical insurance, there's the whole EAP model, the employee assistance programs business, which is constantly morphing and changing. How do you make money? So these are evolving business models as well. So now's the time to make money. And companies will change and their products will change as a result, but they're certainly no longer quietly preparing the groundwork. it is now a platformized sector.
Yeah, and I can imagine it's almost free marketing, right? In terms of, look at us, we are trusted by a gargantuan public health service, the likes of which is unmatched across the world. If that's not a seal of approval, then I don't know what is. So you guys who don't have public healthcare systems, use us, because we're clearly trusted by an evidence-based healthcare model. Shell, obviously I'm looking at this solely from the position of a therapist. You are someone who is slightly higher up the managerial ladder than I am. So I'm curious as to your take on how we've ended up here.
Yeah, I think for me, I think the biggest thing that I'm sitting with is a sense of some naivety, perhaps. So as a service manager in talking therapies, some of what you've described today, Elizabeth, has felt very unfamiliar to my experience of working both clinically in that industry, but also supporting others to work clinically in that place. I'm wondering then if I'm perhaps part of the problem in that respect, in that whilst I like to think that I'm very outward looking, perhaps I am quite insular and have a very narrow focus of attention at the moment, and I'm a little bit blind to some of these changes that are on our imminent horizons, perhaps. And I think if kind of thinking about the burnout theme, perhaps the everyday slog of what we do is a big contributor to that, in that you're absolutely right. You know, we're the public purse. We have to have our KPIs in order to demonstrate that we're value for money. And actually, fundamentally, I don't disagree with that. I feel that that's our responsibility to prove our worth almost. But that is very much part of our everyday slog. And, 7.5 hours, 8 hours a day goes incredibly quickly and in a bit of a blur, and our seasons roll around incredibly quickly. We're coming up to the autumn again. And yeah, maybe my eyes aren't very open to what you've described, because that feels like a very unfamiliar landscape that you've described for me there.
I don't think that you've missed something. I think that firstly, IAPT has always been really patchy, hasn't it? So services have varied enormously and they've also changed over time. And a lot of that's about geographical location and about levels of demand. So rural areas often have done much better because there's a big demand. There's lots of people who want the service and there's not a huge amount of it's the only show in town. And also it always makes a difference if you have a compassionate service leader. People really matter. And the other thing is that this is the narrative of the tech titans and gods in immortal combat with each other. So there's something sort of fantastical. It sounds paranoid and it sounds ridiculous in a way, because it doesn't relate to our experience, but also a very useful strategy, trades unions use it all the time, is when you can't change the universe, maybe it's better that we just stick to who we are and try and create a safe environment in our locality. So everything is local now, because we're not going to get these big macroeconomic changes. There is no revolution around the corner. So in many ways, you're actually maybe just going to decide to carry on. But I do think that there has been an intentional, in the book, I call it an attack on thinking. I think partly because of the unbelievableness of it and the scale of it and the fact that no one's capturing that data. We're capturing the evidence base for psychological therapies. We're not capturing the attrition rates, for example. So one of the big critiques of these models is that, in my view, it is attrition by design, that increasingly complexity and lack of caseness gets squeezed out of the system and no one measures that. And that's a way of gaming the recovery data, because only those people who can somehow navigate it and operate within that system get to go through the treatment. And the absence of looking at the dropout, the being cut off in a call centre, all of that stuff doesn't get measured. So it does get obscured and it doesn't come into our thinking. So I suppose the thing to sort of encourage people is to not feel alienated or critiqued or criticised or shamed by the fact that we've all got to learn something now. We all have to understand this business model. You may decide to carry on doing your role in a more informed way, but it may not change anything about what you do on the day-to-day.
Yeah.
But it's important that we don't body block having a conversation about this and at least understanding the landscape, because I do think that the burnout is linked to the enormous amounts of shame and self-blame that we place on ourselves. I always cry. I cry a lot, but I cry when I interview people, because the amount of, the work that we do is so fabulous. It's such a gift, and it's such a loving gift, and it's a generous gift. Even on a bad day, we're up for being part of somebody's recovery, and offering ourselves and offering our bodies and our minds to somebody else for a short period of time. And yet the amount of people that I listen to describe themselves as failing and as failures is mind-blowing. And this is, in trades union terms, consciousness raising is part of our liberation. Because if we stop ourselves understanding the systems around us, we will blame ourselves. And then that's the end of the conversation. I just need to work harder. And so we do, don't we? Because we're very diligent people. And then we work harder, and then the burnout gets worse, and our sense of reality becomes even more distorted. It's easy to say the burnout thing is, you need to do more self-care, you need to slow it down, But when we're earning such poor wages, that's really quite a proposition, isn't it? And so, again, what do? You blame yourself for being poor on top of it. It's just, there's such an invitation to self-hatred, and we have to resist it. So again, the consciousness raising should help with that. It's not going to take away the incredible dilemma about how do you earn enough to sustain yourself. I don't have a solution, by the way, to the fact that most of us are burnt out. And every single survey I do, it's at about 70% of therapists say they're burnt out. It's a very high figure. And sometimes I've asked really good questions like, as a result of your work, are you burnt out? And again, it's about 70%. So it's not that we've got no emotional skills or, it's that we're really torn by this. It's really hard for therapists to talk about that because there's issues around professional practice and safety. And many of us are working at times when we don't feel entirely safe. Generally, I would say that we do a good balancing act of that, but we have to remove the shame of just saying, look, a lot of us are very tired. And so the invitation to campaign against digital health companies will be passed up, won't it? We just simply don't have that energy to take it all on. See, I call digital therapy an attack on thinking. And I think, in the therapeutic session, often we're mindful of when we blank out and aren't able to think with our clients in the room. I think something like that is happening to our profession. We're not stupid people, and we're not unreflexive. But there has been an attack on our ability to really think about the industrial relations of our sector. So let's accept that, not feel bad about it, and engage.
If I imagine a listener to today's episode, what makes us different to the rest of the NHS, I suppose? I'm thinking about, so I'm married to a nurse, Elizabeth, just for disclosure. My husband's an adult nurse, not a mental health nurse. They're burnt out too, aren't they? And they're really poorly paid. And I'm just wondering, from a listener's perspective, what makes us different? Why are we focusing on therapists instead of the industry as a whole?
Because I think the consequences of us becoming disassociated and burnt out are much higher. I come from a psychoanalytic background, so this may be a bit psychoanalytic for you, but the one of the things that I love about psychoanalysis is that it's very attentive to the details, the things that people think don't matter, and they're also very attentive to understanding and the unconscious. So people not being able to say things in actual words that make sense. Yeah. And it is that ability to engage with that, embrace it, think about it, try and understand it. Bit ambivalent about solving it. I'm not against solutions, but that's not the business that we're in. I like mental health nurses because they'll go, oh, sod it, let's just go to the supermarket and get this person some food and help them with their benefits claims. And I am fully in support of a decent mental health nurse and social workers being all around us. But that's not actually what therapists are there to do. It's a bit like trades unionism for me, is often people come to you and they don't They're actually not asking you to solve the problem. They just want you to hear it and to acknowledge it. And that is powerful. And lots of empowered things can happen as a result of it. If we're not able to be attentive to the people in front of us because we're cut off, we're brittle, we need to get them off the books and into recovery. If we're playing a different game from the one of just paying attention, I think that's very dangerous. And of course, it gets projected into the client, into the patient as well. And we may not be conscious of that. We may not engage with that. But the shaming and the inadequacy and the not quite listening and not giving people enough time ultimately ends up being with our clients. I think a lot of therapists, one of the reasons why they're burnt out is that they're overcompensating or having to compensate for an inadequate framework. I did a survey of 650 IAPT workers in 2019. I asked some really blunt questions about burnout, performance management and all that stuff, and depression, very high, again, 70% depression and anxiety as well as burnout, and, really long-term sort of stories of pain. And then I asked them the question, do you think you're providing a good service? And 62% of people said yes. I was a bit troubled by that. I was like, statistically, it doesn't add up to me. But I had to sort of not be dismissive of that statistic and really look at people's answers to how they felt they would do a good service, because they're using everything that they have. They're using their bodies and minds to make that a decent, process of care.
That is something that I'm much more familiar with. So your description there of the therapist who is completely depleted yet still shows up every day for the clients that they work with, and would still describe what they offer as good therapy, never ceases to amaze me. I'm privileged to do things like management supervisions where I get to talk to people about how they are, and they're still at work, they're doing their job, they're delivering the results that we're asking them to deliver, but they're absolutely on their arses, fatigued beyond all fatigue. And it's almost, it's a norm, isn't it, in the therapy world? In my experience, it's the norm. The imposter syndrome. I've never met a therapist who hasn't got raging imposter syndrome. Never. I've never met a confident, self-assured therapist, and yet they've all got a right to be, because they're all incredibly competent and brilliant at what they do. What I'm hearing is that you're advocating for system review. So we do something about the framework. This isn't even about leadership, is it? We're not talking about your service managers. We're not even talking about your trust CEOs. It's a framework, it's a systems issue.
I think what we have to brace ourselves for is the emergence of a two-tiered system. So the growth is in the private sector.
Yeah.
The way that affects the NHS is partly because at the moment, a lot of the EAP providers are offering pretty good terms and conditions, and they value all of this burnt out experience in the NHS, and, people are running towards that sector. So at the moment, it's a competitive market for experienced therapists to go into the private sector. That will morph and merge. So one of the things that we will see is, I'm always interested in younger generations of therapists, because they don't remember how this was. Same in academia, you know what I mean? It's a different game that is being played, and the choices are different. And I think there's a level of pragmatism with young therapists that is essential. It's much more transactional. And I think that's a good thing. So there's less romance and less sort of disappointment in the whole system. But I do think that there's essentially a brain drain that is happening. All services fall into crisis because there's no fat in the system now. There's no wiggle room. So things have become much less predictable. I think what you're seeing is actually a massive reduction in the therapy sector. So you're seeing a replacement model. And in the middle at the moment, you have EAPs and online therapy platforms, which have their own sort of issues, industrial issues, and then the NHS. But the NHS, in terms of therapists, and face-to-face therapy is shrinking. And it will presumably shrink quite fast once the digital services and AI technologies start to really come into place.
Do you envisage that changing therapists' relationship with burnout?
I'm not going to make you happy with my answer. This platformization represents a deepening of inequalities and work intensification. It's deeper. It's even deeper than this, if you can believe it. And that's partly because of this sort of dynamic system of pricing and pay and the lack of transparency over that. I don't name any names in my book because I don't wish to be sued, but there are different business models. So the direct to consumer, where individuals will just buy services. The argument in the book that this has turned therapy in that setting into a sector of e-commerce. You buy it. And it is true to say that there are some amazing therapists on these platforms listed, and there's a huge diversity. There's a lot more therapists of colour on these services as well, which is a plus. And there's a lot more language diversity and cultural diversity within these platforms, which is important to consumers of therapy. But the argument is that it changes the nature of the relationship in the sense that it is very much sort of, you don't like your therapist, you can move on. And it's, in the book, I call it therapeutic Tinder. As a provocation, it isn't Tinder, but it has those Tinder-esque sort of aspects to it, in that the relationship is not designed for dependency in the traditional psychoanalytic sense. It's, if you don't like it, you can move on, you can choose another. So customer choice is much more sort of evident in that service. But one of the sort of key reasons why I think there's nothing to be cheerful is that these systems at the moment, the pay rates are dependent on number of clients. So you get a much lower rate of pay, hourly rate of pay, if you have like 0 to 5 clients. But if you have 40 to 45 clients, you're on a much, much higher rate of pay. So the model is constantly designed for you to take on board more intensely clients and client loads, so that you're constantly available to the platform to work. So it's very much an Uber model of, you need to have an extraordinary number of available drivers in order to service everybody who wants to drive right now. And it's the same business model for therapists at the moment. This business model may change. It may change to a subscription model. That often happens in digital companies. But right now, you have to be taking a very high number of caseloads in order to get a living wage on that system. So the intensification is really built into the pay structures there. It isn't just about performance. So that doesn't bode well. Although at this point in the UK, most people who work for online therapy platforms treat it as like a temp agency. So they're not working full time. They're using it as a way of building up clients, etc., etc. So we're using them in a very British way at the moment. But depending on what the alternatives are, we may see a movement away from that. And I think also this isn't happening fast, but it's definitely happening, is people taking up private medical insurance now, so that therapy will become an offering by the big insurance companies. So again, the business model and what the jobs actually entail and the hourly rate will shift. And at the moment, we know that for good EAPs and the sort of smaller scale businesses, the industry standard has leveled itself at 40 quid an hour. And that happened with no negotiation, no collective bargaining, nothing. So we're going to see these kind of, industry standards going up and down, depending on the business model, depending on supply and demand. So it's not static, but it's definitely not under our control.
Right. The other thing that occurred to me as you were talking there is that I can imagine this being some sort of maintenance cycle that then leads to less effective therapy in the room as well. If this becomes therapeutic Tinder as suggested in the book, it becomes a case of, well, this therapist made me sit with my distress. I didn't like that, so I ghosted them and I moved on to the next one, where we eventually train ourselves to be that nice, kind therapist that actually doesn't subject our clients to any of the things that we actually need to be doing with them to actually get them to a better place. And you mentioned using those platforms in a very British way so far as therapists. How much has the British way, the British culture kind of got us into this mess in terms of we don't cause a scene, we don't, make a fuss about something that's going on, and we definitely do not talk about wages and pay. How much has that paved the way for where we are now?
Massively, because class is in the room, isn't it? Because you've never been able to earn a really decent, well, it's hard to earn a very decent wage. So in the UK, lot of people married to rich men. That's a very sort of demeaning way of saying it, but people older in age who've earned money another way or have family income have really been free to take up the training and all the free labour that's implied in all of that in terms of professional registration. I mean, we have a system of patronage really in our training system and clinical training model, that it's really hard to get diversity in a profession which demands that you don't earn a living wage. So it was very hard to do that, and the only real way of doing that, I mean, that was one of the big sort of dreams of IAPT, was that it could make it an actual job that you could actually live on that money, and so yeah, it's a story about class and race, and about the difficulties of talking about that. And we're very late to the game to have political debates. It's also about the culture of trades unionism and the absence of industrial thinking. I mean, if you don't need to earn a living wage, you're not going to lose your job fighting for it for other people, so there hasn't been a need or an appetite really in the profession to politicise and join unions, although many of us do, and many of us come from a union background. But I think that the sort of class perspective and the sort of depoliticization of how therapists talk about a sector which has been profoundly politicized through welfare reform and austerity, we're part of a major political project here. And there's some sort of great writings and interesting debates about it, but we haven't let it sort of feed into the way that we talk about money and organising in the sector. I think by necessity it has to, because it's a real divide and rule. So you say, oh, I'm thinking, I don't know what's going on around me. Well, if you're not working in IAPT, you have literally no idea what's going on in IAPT. We're very cliquey in terms of what we understand this sector to look like. And of course, many people, we call it private practice, but many people are self-employed 0 hours workers. And I think there's a certain degree of, you will see this a lot in the platformization of the professions. In our heads, we've got a professional identity and we see ourselves that way. But in an industrial sense, we're not even being paid money for doing our work. A lot of people are for free. I like this idea of a 17th century French court, fussing about your lace cuffs, but actually not worrying about the fact that there's no bread, So we have this culture in the British context where our class consciousness, our lack of it, is really holding us back here. But by necessity, we're here, aren't we? We really have to have these conversations now.
Elizabeth, that was really evident to me. I did a counselling degree. That's how I found my way into this world. And exactly that, very middle class, white women of a certain age who had a bit of time on their hands. And I really don't mean that to be demeaning. That was the experience. I felt I was from a council estate, very, very different class. The expectation that I put myself through 40 hours of personal therapy, which I pay for myself, the expectation that I give up 200 hours of my own time to deliver bereavement counselling. I sourced and then paid for supervision for myself. At my interview to get onto the degree, I was told very clearly I was very unlikely to make a career out of counselling, but they took my £9,000 a year in tuition fees. They watched me go through that degree because I had a passion, I'd had mental health experiences of my own and I wanted to be in that world. What do we think about the ethics of the course providers, particularly in industries like counselling, where very often there aren't any jobs? People are self-employed 0-hour contract workers. You are expected to fund your own way through the job that some people might call vocational. and that idea that you're, having to pay your dues, should we even be providing these training courses to the extent that we are? The universities across the country that will happily take your 3 years worth of student finance from you.
I have a problem with our professional bodies. I have a problem with the structure of the training and the registration, and I have a problem at that time with the sort of collusion with welfare reform that happened through the psychotherapy bodies. I felt it was a low blow and it didn't represent members' interests. And I used to say, there are good people tucked away in these systems. If you can stay in there and have those arguments at board meetings, please do it on our behalf, because real institutional change is who turns up at meetings. So having good people in those meetings is important. Now I'm less sure that's my advice. I'm a bit more revolutionary. Very obsessed with this Versailles motif in my life at the moment. I think we might fast be reaching the point where we have to find an alternative model. The problem is, how do all of us exhausted, good-meaning people actually do that? How do we do it? I want to tell you about, I don't know if you ever were in contact with the Counsellors Together UK, CTUK, which was the largest network of therapists in the UK until the end of last year, when my friend Maria Albertson, who I worked with a lot over the last few years, she died. She set it up. She was a working class woman. And she set up a network, which was the first network which talked about money and wages. And she was one of the fiercest campaigners about unpaid labour within the profession and took it to the professional bodies. She and I used to do lots of sort of consultations with Parliament around this, always do loads of submissions. And in many ways very unpopular, but she was one of the smartest political operators, and we've lost a lot by her prematurely dying in December last year. She was also a single parent to 3 kids, and she was everything. So she built up C2UK, which had around 10,000 members. It's no longer in existence, unfortunately. So there's a bit of a vacuum at the moment in our professional spaces for someone who is willing to champion that conversation about finances. We did 2 very big surveys in 2021 and 2023, I think, looking at the financial landscape. So I'm just writing these for academic publication now, so I will let you know when they come out. But again, it was one of those sort of like first mappings, because you ask really awful questions like how many therapists use food banks, and it's 4%. And anyway, that's not a massive figure during a cost of living crisis, but isn't that a horrible thought, that your therapist doesn't have enough to eat? I mean, nurses face this. Nursing is at 10%, but She had access, and people were prepared to talk about money in her space. So C2K, she particularly, because she was a really charismatic working class woman, which is, this space needs that. She was able to invite people in to have that really difficult conversation and then to turn it into political action. She, in her campaigning time, only really managed to get to the point of everybody suddenly saying, yeah, it's not okay to work for free, which is quite a low bar, isn't it, in industrial relations? But that took 10 years. And she was sort of very skillfully critical, but also collegial and collaborative with the professional bodies about identifying the pressure points that they had to get right. Because the thing with the professional bodies is, if they continue to be politically blind, they're going to fail in their own terms, which is around diversity. This is their Achilles heel, that if you create a system that only rich white middle-aged women can afford, you have a problem with diversity, which is and inclusion, which is a zero-sum game. In my book, I call it professional cannibalism, that if we can't make those political changes, if we can't create services that are actually accessible and affordable professions, then we're just eating ourselves. And so far, after 10 years of really campaigning and evidence-based campaigning, we had no results. So I would say that, no, I don't think it's ethical, but I think more importantly, it's going to kill the profession, essentially, because we're just going to eat ourselves. And I think that's a real shame. So, you know, the trouble is that those of us who are really politically active within the sector are also really burnt out as well. So you've got to choose your battles, haven't you? We did a good running, and I must say I've lost my kind of va-va-voom about taking on the professional bodies since she passed. You know, she's a huge energetic force. But that energetic force will come again. And I hope it comes from a group of psychological wellbeing practitioners who understand the game that's being played here. So there's definitely a space for a critique of the professional bodies, but we have to do it at a time when we've got energy and we can do it in an intelligent way. But yeah, there's an opportunity there.
We've obviously focused a lot so far today on the systemic issues, understandably, and I'm also conscious of time, and thank you for joining us for as long as you have, Elizabeth. No worries at all.
I love that about therapists, because they don't talk much, and then as soon as they do, like,
you can't stop them, right? Yeah, it's amazing. But I suppose just in the time that we have left, perhaps funneling this down to the individual, and more accurately for this next question, the individuals involved in therapy. 100% of us on this podcast right now have been clients at some point or other. If clients happen to listen to this podcast, well, firstly, applause from me for listening to this for an hour when you're not a trainee CBT therapist. Well done for getting through all of this. What is their piece of the puzzle in all of this? What should their takeaway be from this book as a client?
Oh, the power's in your hands. If therapy is turning into a sector of e-commerce, consumer rights is really a very powerful place to be. And I don't mean that in a cynical way. I mean that in, if you're paying for it, you will know profoundly the difference between what is offered and what is actually provided. And I have enormous confidence in the intelligence of ordinary people on both sides of the therapeutic relationship to know what's the good stuff and what isn't the good stuff. And I'm not saying they can't find the good stuff in this UberTherapy landscape. Good stuff is there. But their choices are going to really determine how the business model shifts or doesn't. I do also think that we are becoming more attentive to the algorithmic risks and harms of digital systems. And I think particularly over time, it's certainly where my research and my sort of impact work is going, is towards consumer rights and protections. We will see models of digital therapy kite marks. We'll see businesses try and persuade us about the quality of their products. And it's really going to be a very powerful position for consumers to challenge that and to stop buying the rubbish stuff. I mean, I think this is true for therapists as well. You have to use your gut and your intuition about what is being sold to you and what is actually being given to you, about the nature of the therapeutic relationship. So, I mean, I don't have words of comfort, but I do have enormous confidence that it really is for the individual to determine whether they're in a safe environment, and if they're not, to move on, to find a different environment. And I think therapists are very attentive to that as well. So I don't feel hopeless about it, but I think there's a huge amount of cultural shift and news and media about raising the level of the debate about the future of therapy, because at the moment we've got very stuck in, you know, bad therapists. And if you go on to Reddit and type in the phrase bad therapy, you know, you're going to get some eye-watering stuff out there. So there's a lot of blaming and shaming of the therapy world as well. So the more intelligent our debate can be about what's happening when we're having therapy digitally, through podcasts, through really working with journalists, through working with academics and researchers, I think we stand a chance of upping our game about what we're talking about when we're talking about digital therapy. So that I'm optimistic about, but culturally and on a popular level, we might be heading for some more intelligent debates about that, which I think will be very helpful.
Hopefully so. I mean, the amount of clients that I personally have heard come into treatment and sort of say, well, I'll take whatever I can get, whatever helps. And I'm hopeful that despite the threats, this offers us actually the opportunity to begin developing a psychologically more discerning landscape in terms of what is it that I should be getting here? What are the ingredients of this therapy? What should I be receiving? Because I think lots of clients, understandably, might I add, when feeling a tremendous amount of distress, it's just, it doesn't matter what I get. I just want to be fixed. I just want to be patched up and put back out there again. You set out some survival don'ts. Don't blame yourself. Don't keep calm and carry on. Don't go it alone. Could you walk us through what those might look like in practice for some of our listeners?
Yeah, so this comes from my body of work, Surviving Work. So working with trades unionists and health workers around how do you actually survive it. I've just noticed that there's lots of don'ts, aren't there? I am such a negative person, and I often rage against positive psychology. Well, I'm just not that positive about it, but actually I might need to reformulate it. So in my formulation is quite aggressive. It says the first thing is don't blame yourself. And I think that's really important because particularly social media and working online, the shame game goes up, the volume goes up in shaming. So I think really being attentive to feelings of shame and that it's all my fault and internalizing something that is systemic is absolutely key. Just stop, pay attention, okay? Try to put up your boundaries, around what comes into you as a result of engaging with therapy, both as a worker and as a client. The second thing is don't keep calm and carry on. So there's a lot to say about anger. As a trades unionist, I think it can be very useful. That's actually an invitation to allow you to use your anger, to own your anger and work through your anger. So that's the therapy game. The third thing is don't be brilliant, and this is particularly true for therapists who will try and overcompensate and think that by working harder they're going to solve the problem. And I think also this is maybe a class thing, but it's also a professional thing, that we are exceptional. Some of us think we're exceptional. And Sally Weintraub, climate psychoanalyst who writes about climate change, calls it Noah's Arkism. That there's a lot of people who still think they've got a place on the boat. So they still feel they're not going to completely critique or rock the system. People like me think there is no boat. So it's an invitation to address our feelings of exceptionalism, that somehow these big systemic changes don't apply to us, that we're different, that we can make everything better. I would invite you to resist that urge. And then penultimately, don't go it alone. So I just put it bluntly to you. If you are not part of a progressive therapist network or a trades union, then you need to do that right now. Don't go it alone. And then finally, create safe spaces and active spaces. So I think this final positive statement is an invitation to trust that you are creating safe spaces in your work environment. Collegiality, being able to work in a safe way within your teams is an achievement, and it is a necessity, because as soon as you become isolated within your teams, you're really in trouble. But also active spaces, so making more demands on each other, not just to share a problem, but to actually say, can you help me with this? Or this is how I can help you. So making the outcome of our interactions much more constructive. So really seeking answers and seeking things that we can do.
Very helpful words of advice and encouragement there for people. Don't take this lying down. Elizabeth, firstly, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people find out more about you and your work? Where might they be able to buy UberTherapy?
So it's UberTherapy. You can buy it from Bristol University Press, but it's on the platforms, because even in publishing, you can't avoid the algorithms. So you can buy my book at any point in time. But I write, and a lot of my work is on surviving work. So www.survivingwork.org. I do blogging and has all of my sort of collections of writings. But my current research is called the Digital Therapy Project.org. And that's a growing sort of network of practitioners and researchers looking at the future of digital therapy.
To all the listeners out there as well, make sure you support your local independent bookshop as well. I'm sure they will be very happy to see your custom. Thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us. Thank you for your time for your expertise. And we hope to chat with you again soon. Well, Shell, that was a very interesting talk, and admittedly, this isn't the intention of the book. As someone who has not only worked for Talking Therapies for a few years now, but also does some work for an ad hoc online therapy platform that helps the NHS with its capacity from time to time, I feel a little bit like a turkey that's voted for Christmas. What are your thoughts on what we covered during that?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant description, Ravi, because I'm very similar to you. So whilst I don't work very clinically in my NHS job anymore, my clinical activity is all on a digital platform. So yeah, I think I did find that very interesting. It was very enlightening in lots of ways. And I think there are a couple of big kind of take homes for me. So my experience of the NHS, I think, is very different to the one that perhaps Elizabeth has experienced through her research. And I get that. I understand that kind of nationally the pitch is going to be different. You know, across the country, we're going to have very different, wildly different reports of working conditions and practices, and even under something as, manualized as talking therapies. But actually, I didn't work in a diverse therapeutic world until I joined the NHS. Up until that point, diversity wasn't part of that experience for me. And within the NHS, I work with an incredibly diverse bunch of people. And I'm not just talking about ethnicity, I'm talking about, sexuality, I'm talking about class, I'm talking about our ability from a physical perspective. That makes us very accessible because, people like to be seen by people who can understand them. So I suppose that felt like a little bit of a bit where I kind of jarred against, I suppose, Elizabeth's experience, if that makes any sense.
I agree with you. I think there are some claims that I think in the book, more than the interview that we've just conducted today, that similarly to what you said in the interview, don't really represent what I have seen. Now, I think possibly to add to Elizabeth's point, that might be potentially because of patchy service, right?
Yeah.
In terms of some NHS talking therapies being radically different to others, and individuals higher up the chain in those services coming up with, I guess, more unique ways to problem solve particular issues.
Lots of creativity in some services, isn't there?
Exactly that. Let's not forget that there is an IAPT manual for a reason. And I think a lot of the things that are referred to in this book that I don't recognise actually stray from that manual quite significantly. And so we're now in this sort of very strange paradox of it's actually going off the manual that has led to some of these quite significant critiques that we do see of some services. Again, I don't see this where I work. Listeners, if you see some of the claims levelled in this book could be attributed to your services, please get in touch. hello@twolostsouls.co.uk and let us know. I think it's important to have a dialogue about this. I also think that at points it sadly takes the nuance out of what we do. There's a quote here of tasks becoming standardized, reducing skills and discretion of workers, and intensifying workloads on preset targets. Again, this may be where I work. There isn't someone watching over me at all times, making sure that I rigidly stick to a particular therapeutic protocol. I am very glad to be able to use the metaphor with clients that I see CBT as being ice cream. And CBT, to clarify for listeners, is not just one thing. It's a suite of therapies. There's 3 whole waves of CBT. And you will get some flavors from me. You might really like those flavors and get on with them and get what you need from them. But there might be some flavors that you need from a therapeutic journey that I don't offer. However, someone else in the service I work in might do. And I think that shows that despite having this cachet of quite rigid manualization, structure and framework, we work hard to find flex amongst the fidelity and still get people where they need to go on their journey in a way that works for them and in a way that's not cookie cutter, I guess. Some of the other quite interesting claims in here are IAPT not being overseen by the CQC. The way it works from where I sit as someone who's solely a therapist is that the CQC oversees the quality of care delivered by this trust, which therefore includes the work of the Talking Therapies team that I work in. And I suppose as a manager, is that how you see it? Is that how you would say it goes? Or really, are we operating in some sort of lawless Wild West situation?
Yeah, no, my understanding is exactly the same as yours, Ravi. We are working within a trust, and we are as open to scrutiny, really so, as every other service, actively engaging in CQC discussion. And I think we're very transparent, actually. Talking Therapies, that's one of the things that, and you've heard me slag off Talking Therapies enough on other episodes. For our many flaws, we have a lot. I don't for a second think that we're perfect, but actually what I think we are very good at doing is being very transparent for the most part. And this is what we offer, this is how we do it, and people make choices about whether they access it or not. And we don't claim to be things that we're not. CBT is a big part of NHS Talking Therapies, and it has been for a very long time, since its inception. However, in the last 7 years or so, we've developed to include so many other modalities, so many other offerings. And we're doing that because there's client demand, and secondly, because otherwise we risk becoming very stagnant and not having anything fresh to offer. So I think we're doing our best to be progressive, inclusive, and actually, we have kind of digitalized areas of some of our service. I know of trusts that will use a kind of digital triage, for example, something we've certainly looked at. And I absolutely hear what Elizabeth is saying and her concerns. I really do. I also think that I had therapy 26 years ago, probably longer than that, actually. The very first time. And I had 2 courses of therapy, and one of them was particularly poor. There was no platform to say how poor it was. No platform at all. No kind of therapist TripAdvisor where I could leave a review. No right to choose. There was no option for me to kind of, voice my concerns or ask for somebody else. Quite glad now that our therapeutic consumers, if that's kind of what we're going to call them, have some choice and can talk with their feet, even if that is slightly Tinderized. If we swipe across, and choice can never be a bad thing, can it? I don't think what's right for one isn't always going to be right for another.
I'm wondering if that was in the context of, I guess, knowing what is right for you as part of a therapeutic approach.
Yeah,
right?
I think that was a very good point. Yeah,
because I think coming towards the end, we spoke about Reddit. Admittedly, one of the things that perhaps I've started doing too frequently is going along some Reddit therapy subreddits and commenting about things. And some of the things you read on there are downright scary, particularly in landscapes where there isn't much regulation and people don't know what they should be receiving as part of a therapeutic package. And I think that people need to be making informed choices rather than deciding their therapist on a whim or because of some dopamine-based app, selection strategy.
Or because of cost, because it's, because you might be priced out of the better quality therapy end.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's another thing, actually, in that has it not always been the case of you mostly get what you pay for?
Yeah, it has, and it really, really has. And again, one of the things that brought me into the NHS was the fact that it's, free for the person accessing it. And hopefully there's a level of consistency into the quality that people will receive for the most part. That's where I feel that, and this might be very naive, but that's where I feel that having something like a manualized therapy provision, such as kind of IAPT Talking Therapies, what it's aiming to do actually is to deliver something that's consistent and everybody knows what to expect.
Yeah, well, sorry to interrupt. I'm just intrigued. We've obviously had a point there about CBT being ice cream and the variances that do occur. How are both things possible at the same time in terms of achieving consistency while still having that flex?
I suppose when I talk about consistency, Ravi, I suppose what I mean is the framework. So if we kind of think about Elizabeth's point that where the framework is kind of off in different areas, people's expectations are going to match that, aren't they? So when we've got something that is manualized, if you think about the Talking Therapies manual, it will very clearly tell, firstly, the clinical population, but also the therapeutic population, what is expected of them and what they should expect. So that should always be consistent, shouldn't it? Because it's very clear, it's really clear. There doesn't need to be any variance or deviance from that. What will be different is the individual's flavour of ice cream, to go back to your metaphor, because you're absolutely right. If you work with me as a therapist trained at exactly the same university that you were trained as, Ravi, you will get a very different experience, but you'll get it within the same framework. And that matters, I think. That's very important.
Yeah.
And I suppose what I heard from Elizabeth is that actually outside of the NHS, when we're talking a little bit more about kind of maybe less regulated or less monitored services, such as the kind of new digital offerings or private practice, there isn't that framework. They're not working to a set of kind of conditions, So the therapists have an idea about what's expected of them when they're working in that way. And the people accessing the services don't know what to expect because it's not clearly laid out. And you might, as with ice cream, you might get, your favourite flavour by luck, by, just fortuitously, you might rock up and get, your rum and raisin, which is my favourite, Ravi, and I know you hate it, and have an amazing experience. Or you get the kind of, grainy, isn't churned properly vanilla, does not suit your needs, and they're within very different frameworks. So right. I suppose that's what I mean by consistency. And I suppose that's something I feel very proud of, actually, in Talking Therapies. I'm very passionate that firstly, that we're working in an ethical way within our framework, within our manual. That matters to me individually. And that's what led me away from working privately, I think.
Yeah. And once again, we are quite fortunate to be viewing this through the lens of working for services and, in Cheryl's case, leading a service that adheres to the manual, that actually does things, as the manual would say, is meant to be done while still, returning back to this ice cream metaphor, we've built an ice cream parlour big enough to fit all the different flavours of ice cream that we need to meet the taste demands of our local population without having to leave that ice cream parlour and walk around. I suppose the difficulty then comes, though, there will be the occasional person who wants, I don't know, avocado and walnut, which neither of us have. And it then becomes a very difficult and I guess a guilt-inducing prospect because, as I suppose, as Elizabeth said, people do get kind of pushed out of the system and do fall between the cracks sometimes. And I think the challenge for me there is that we know that as we're doing that, and as individual therapists, that hurts. Like when you hear someone's story and you're sitting there and you're going, well, hang on a minute, the annoying thing is that the numbers aren't adding up here, or this doesn't kind of fit with what we offer. So I'm afraid we're going to have to signpost you here. Or the worst thing is when we have to go back to a GP and say, well, they just don't fit in with what we can offer. So we have to give them back to you and you have to figure something out. And on an individual level, that does result in a lot of guilt. And I suppose what I'm hearing, though, is that the want here is for the system to take that into account rather than the individual therapist.
Yeah. And I couldn't agree with that anymore. I'll be honest with you. And, we can't be all things to all people. None of us can. And there are gaps in provision, private, in the NHS, there are gaps. We're all kind of fundamentally aware of that. And it does leave you feeling a kind of way, responsible, guilty, shame, all of those words that I heard Elizabeth talk about earlier. I don't think that's unique to therapy. There are gaps in provision in all health services, cancer care, weight loss management. There are gaps in provision everywhere, and I don't know the answers. I don't know what the answers are. They're political, probably. What I do know is that for the most part, the people that I have the pleasure of working alongside, the people that I've supported on their therapy journeys, I've been very privileged to get to do that and continue to do that. What they all share is passion to relieve distress for others, all of them. And actually, they don't think about things like the business model. They're not thinking about the financial models. They're thinking about, how can I be the best version of the therapist in front of the clients that I'm going to work with that I can be? And that's a great starting point, I think. The other stuff, the model stuff, the business model stuff, I think Elizabeth was right. We need the passionate, informed and able people who can stand up and be voices for lots of perhaps people who haven't time to have a voice because they're working incredibly hard. So yeah, I'm not really sure what point I'm trying to make there, but
no, yeah, I suppose what I'm hearing you say there is that there needs to be a champion. And admittedly, I think during the interview, I found myself becoming quite cynical in terms of how these things have been designed. Again, to use another flowery metaphor, I get the sense that what's really going on here is that if you have to keep your head down, you're not able to look at the stars and see which direction you need to be headed in.
Yeah.
And this is all by design. And in some ways, that's kind of scary to think about in terms of how many dominoes have fallen so far, what domino are we on now, and what's going to happen with the rest of these that fall after this one. I think to, add one final, I think explicit critique to some of the material that's in the book, there is a section when it discusses IAPT, Talking Therapies, CBT, that discusses supervision. And it says, but over time, two things happened. A shifting of the classification of IAPT services from psychotherapy to psychological therapies, where the NICE requirement for supervision was not mandatory, where even if you are a psychotherapist, if you are working under a psychological therapy contract, there is no obligation for employers to provide supervision. I think it's important for me to say that when it comes to supervision, there are BABCP requirements for high-intensity therapists in terms of the amount of hours of supervision they receive in a year. When you, as listeners, come to do your first accreditation audit, little tip from me, make sure you log all your supervisions as you go through, because it will save a lot of hassle by the end of that year when you evidence not only how many hours you've had, but who you discussed and why you discussed them. You never know when you could be pulled up for a re-audit. So that's a practice that should continue. And again, it could be the privilege I have of working for a service where this has been taken into account. Supervision has flowed like water. It's never been something that's hard to come by.
Yeah. So the description of supervision, the lack of supervision that Elizabeth describes in the book, again, really surprised me. It's not something that I'm familiar with at all. And I actually think we're incredibly well supervised as therapists at all steps. So our psychological wellbeing practitioners, they have one week it's case management, the next week it's clinical skills. It's incredibly consistent. We have our high intensities who have peer supervision. They have good practice group. They have their own clinical supervision every 4 weeks. They have management supervision. They have long-term conditions supervision, and we have safeguarding supervision. So actually we have more supervision than you can shake a stick at, really, Ravi. And they do their clinical activity on top of that. So again, that isn't a world that I have any knowledge of, if I'm being very honest. From the very beginnings of my journey in therapy, supervision has been a fundamental element of that. It's never changed. It's not lessened at all. It's grown. And I think its importance has developed even further with, excellent discussions around our kind of clinical governance responsibilities and the role of clinical leads within our services to ensure that we have highly trained supervisors. I know back in the day, anybody could supervise you. Now you have to be trained, you have to have gone on the talking therapy training course to do that. Rightly so. So it's not something I'm familiar with. And I would love, if we have people listening to this and you're finding it difficult to secure the supervision that you're entitled to, and you'll know what you're entitled to. Read the manual, it will absolutely tell you. But at the very minimum, you need enough to meet your BABCP accreditation requirements. So if you're not, let us know. Let's start kind of thinking about these trusts that are scrimping on the essentials.
Yeah, I mean, one of the significant takeaways from the interview today was organisation, right? And so there we go. There's Michelle offering to be your personal placard holder. We will, we can offer a good rate on her being there for any like employee tribunals and stuff. Just get in contact. hello@twolostsouls.co.uk. For the avoidance of doubt, that is a joke, just in case anyone does try to email us.
We'll see.
You are very busy. You do a lot of things already, and I'm pretty sure you don't need another iron in the fire.
No, but I'm having a couple of weeks annual leave, Ravi, so I've got a bit of time on my hands at the moment. So yeah, we'll see.
What you use that email address for is to your discretion, listeners. Some of you may also be listening and going, well, hey, hang on a second. Didn't you guys do a recent episode on like careers in technology with CBT? Isn't this completely counterintuitive to that? To get my Dr. Richard Bennett quote for the day in, other views are available. This is something that I think is it's actually an incredibly emotive issue. Like, we're talking about technology and machines, but actually it's emotive. This has an impact on people and their lives, the clients that we work with. It's going to impact on your ability potentially to put food on the table and continue to live the life you would like to live. And I think it's a bit of a strokes for folks scenario. There may be some of you who completely agree with the views expressed in UberTherapy. There may be some of you who definitely disagree with the views expressed in UberTherapy. However, either way, it provides a significant amount of food for thought. The episode we did with Sven Law on careers and technology also does that. And I think the important thing here is to retain enough power to be able to pick your path and follow the life you would like to lead. As usual, if you want to get in touch with us and inform us of any other topics you'd like us to cover, or if you've got any questions or feedback on anything we've covered today, please give us an email on hello@twolostsouls.co.uk. Other than that, thank you all so much for listening, and we will catch you soon on another episode of Two Lost Souls.